The year was 1883, and the Missouri River at Providence Bend had long since receded from its spring flood, leaving behind a scarred bank of mud, bleached driftwood, and the town's accumulated refuse. It was in this graveyard of forgotten things that Eliza Gable, all of 19 years and possessed of nothing save the clothes on her back and a small, worn satchel, found her future. She stood before the half-swallowed carcass of the wanderer, a sternwheeler that had met its end not in a dramatic snagging or boiler explosion, but in a slow, undignified sinking at its mooring a decade prior. Its upper decks had been scavenged for lumber years ago, leaving only the skeletal outline of its main deck and a hull mostly buried in the silt and clay of the riverbank, a forgotten monument to failure that the townsfolk no longer even saw. To them, it was just another feature of the landscape, as unremarkable as a strangely shaped boulder. To Eliza, it was the answer to a question she had been too afraid to ask herself. How was she to survive the coming winter? Her arrival in Providence Bend had been as quiet and unremarkable as a dead leaf skittering down the dusty main street. Orphaned by a fever that had taken her father 2 years prior and left homeless by the subsequent sale of their small eastern boatyard, she had drifted west on a tide of rumor and hope, finding only that hardship was the same in any geography. She had worked for board and a pittance at a boarding house until the owner's wife decided her presence was an unwelcome distraction for the male lodgers. Now, with the first hints of autumn sharpening the evening air, her options had narrowed to a single terrifying point. She had $2, earned from mending clothes, folded into a tight square in her pocket. It was this meager fortune she carried to the town clerk's office, a place that smelled of stale tobacco and decaying paper, to inquire about the wreck. The clerk, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary disinterest, had to consult a dusty ledger to even confirm the town technically owned the derelict. He sold it to her for the $2, a transaction he found so absurdly pitiful that he did not even bother to write up a proper deed, instead scrawling a receipt on a scrap of paper that he signed with a flourish of cynical amusement. Word of the transaction traveled through Providence Bend with the speed of idle gossip. It was not anger or outrage that greeted the news, but a wave of pity and derisive laughter. Amos Kelleher, a man who had built his own sod house with his own 2 hands and considered himself the foremost authority on practical matters, saw her a few days later as she began the Sisyphean task of digging. He stood on the high bank, his hands on his hips, a figure of unimpeachable common sense. "Girl," he called down, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? That's a mud pit, not a home. You'll catch your death of swamp fever before the first frost." Eliza paused, leaning on her shovel, a tool she had borrowed from the blacksmith in exchange for a week of sweeping his shop, and looked up at him. She merely wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a muddy wrist. "It has a foundation," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Amos spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "It's a rotten boat is what it is. Winter's coming. You need 4 solid walls and a roof, not a dream." His wife, Dora, spread a more theatrical version of the story, telling the ladies at the general store that the poor Gable girl had clearly lost her wits to grief and destitution, talking about foundations as if a sunken boat was a plot of land. It became a kind of sad entertainment for the town, watching the slender girl toil in the mud day after day. Constance Hartwell, whose farm sat on the edge of town, watched with a different kind of interest. She said little, but she noted the methodical way Eliza worked, the straightness of her trench lines, the steady, unhurried rhythm of her labor. It was not the frantic work of desperation, but the careful work of purpose. The community saw a girl digging mud away from a rotten hull. They saw folly and a slow march toward a winter tragedy. What they could not see was the memory that guided every thrust of Eliza's shovel, the voice of her father, Silas Gable, that echoed in her mind with the clarity of a recent conversation. Silas had not been merely a builder of boats. He had been a student of them. He believed that a well-made hull was one of the most perfect structures devised by man, a seamless marriage of strength, buoyancy, and endurance. "Most men see a boat," he had told her once, tracing the curve of a rib with his calloused hand. "I see a principle, the principle of displacement, of sealed integrity. But there's another principle they always forget, Eliza. The principle of insulation he had built his boats with a double hull, a costly and time-consuming method others had abandoned for quicker profits. Between the inner and outer planking of seasoned white oak, he would pack a dense layer of wool felt and tar-soaked cork. A boat's worst enemy ain't the rocks, girl, he'd explained. It's the water. Not just the water outside, but the water that seeps in, the damp that rots the wood from the inside out. This layer, he tapped the inner wall, it keeps the damp out, but it also keeps the warmth in and the cold out. A ship's hull is a barrier. It doesn't know if it's keeping water out or winter out. The principle is the same. This was the knowledge that fueled her. The Wanderer was a ruin to everyone else, but Eliza, in her first exploratory excavation, had found the proof of her father's wisdom. After clearing a small section of the hull down to the keel, she had taken an auger bit and drilled a test hole. It passed through the outer planking, met the resistance of the packed insulation, and then broke through to the inner planking. The wood shavings that came out were dry and smelled faintly of oak and tar, not the foul stench of rot. The mud and the river, the very things that had seemingly destroyed the boat, had instead formed a perfect, airtight seal, preserving the lower hull in a state of arrested decay. The silt had acted as a second, massive layer of insulation, protecting the craftsmanship hidden within. The secret of the Wanderer was not gold or hidden cargo. It was the forgotten, expensive, and masterfully executed double hull construction that made it less a wreck and more a perfectly preserved vessel, waiting for someone who understood its language. When she tried to explain this to Amos Kelleher, pointing to the dark, solid wood she had exposed, he had simply shaken his head. Wood is wood, girl, and wood in mud is rotten wood. You're trying to make a silk purse from a sow's ear. He saw only the material. Eliza saw the system. Watching an outcome, her father used to say, was not the same as understanding the principle. The townsfolk saw a sunken boat. She saw a house that had already been built, one that simply needed to be unearthed. Her process was a slow, grueling testament to her faith in that principle. She began not by trying to empty the entire structure, but by digging a deep, wide trench around the entire perimeter of the buried hull, a moat that would allow the surrounding riverbank to drain away from her worksite. This took her 3 weeks of back-breaking labor, her hands blistering, breaking open, and callousing into tough pads of leather. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by the bread and salted pork that Constance Hartwell began leaving for her in a small basket on the high bank each morning. A silent gesture of support that meant more to Eliza than any spoken encouragement. Once the trench was complete and the hull stood like a wooden whale in a dry dock of clay, she addressed the water and mud inside. She could not bail it all. Instead, she located the lowest point of the stern and, using a long-handled ship's auger she had found half-buried in the bilge, she drilled a series of holes through the hull. The trapped water gushed out into her trench, draining the wreck over the course of 2 days. The mud remained, a thick, heavy slurry that had to be removed 1 bucket at a time. It was foul, stinking work, and in it she found the detritus of the boat's last days. A broken bottle, a woman's silver-backed hairbrush, a child's leather shoe, its laces still tied. She hauled out hundreds of buckets of the thick silt, dumping them to form a wide, high berm on the river-facing side of the boat, a deliberate act of fortification against the next spring's flood. As she cleared the interior, the sheer genius of the boat's construction became more apparent. The main deck beams, massive timbers of solid oak, were mostly sound where they had been protected from the elements. The space was long and narrow, but it was vast to a girl who had been sleeping in a boarding house pantry. She chose a 20-foot section in the stern as her living space. With a borrowed crosscut saw, a tool that took all her strength and leverage to operate, she painstakingly cut away the rotten decking that had once been exposed to the sky, creating an open space that she would later roof. The scavenged parts of the upper decks now served her well. She found usable planks and timbers in the weeds, cast aside by the original salvagers who had only taken the best and easiest pieces. She patched the few soft spots in the hull, not with new wood she couldn't afford, but with sheets of tin she hammered flat from old cans. Sealing them with a thick layer of pine tar, she rendered herself over a small fire. The work was slow and methodical, each small victory a testament to her persistence. She became a familiar sight to the men who worked on the new railway spur, a solitary figure of industry who asked for nothing but to be allowed to pick through their scrap piles for discarded metal and timber. They, like the rest of the town, thought her mad, but her quiet determination earned her a grudging respect, and they soon set aside usable pieces of wood and iron for her. Her father had taught her that a house breathes, and that controlling its breath was the key to warmth. A sod house, like Amos Kelleher's, was warm because of the sheer thermal mass of its earthen walls. But it was also perpetually damp, the sod sweating with the changes in temperature. An all-wood cabin was dry but bled heat through 1,000 tiny gaps between the logs. Her boathouse, she reasoned, could have the best of both worlds. The hull provided the insulated, waterproof barrier. Now she needed to build the roof and manage the air. She framed a low, gently sloped roof over the open section using the salvaged timbers, a design meant to shed snow easily. For the roofing itself, she laid down a layer of the best planks she could find, but she knew this was not enough. She spent a week hauling buckets of clay up from the riverbank, mixing it with dry grass to act as a binder. She plastered this thick, adobe-like mixture over the plank roof, creating a seamless, waterproof shell. On top of this, she laid a thick layer of sod cut from the prairie above the riverbank, turning her roof into a living part of the landscape. The final piece of the puzzle was the stove, a small pot-bellied model she bought from the blacksmith for a promise of mending all his work clothes for the entire winter. She did not place it in the center of the room as was custom. Instead, she installed it near the stern wall and ran the stovepipe not straight up through the roof, but horizontally for nearly 10 feet before it exited, a long black artery running the length of her living space. The townsfolk who saw it scoffed. "She'll smoke herself out," Amos declared to anyone who would listen. "That pipe will never draw proper." Eliza, however, was applying another of her father's principles, maximizing energy transfer. A straight pipe, he had taught her, vents most of its heat directly into the sky. It was wasteful. A horizontal run allowed the hot smoke and gases to linger, radiating their heat into the living space for much longer before exiting. The heat would warm the iron pipe, which in turn would warm the air around it, creating a gentle, circulating current throughout the long, narrow room. To complete her system, she built a small, insulated fresh air intake pipe that ran from the outside, under the floorboards she had installed, and terminated directly beside the stove's own air intake. This meant the fire would draw its oxygen from the outside, not from the warm air inside her sealed space, eliminating the cold drafts that plagued every other house in the settlement. Her home would not be fighting the winter. It would be coexisting with it, sipping the cold air it needed for combustion while keeping the precious warmth sealed inside its wooden, tarred, and earthen shell. It was a closed system, efficient and elegant. To the outside world, it looked like a half-buried wreck with a grassy mound on top, a chimney pipe sticking out at an odd angle. It was an object of pity, a testament to the foolishness of a desperate girl. Eliza, laying her hand against the smooth, cool oak of the inner hull, felt only a profound sense of security. She had not built a house. She had restored a masterpiece. The first test came not gradually, but with the sudden, violent fury of a true Dakota blizzard. The sky, which had been a placid, pale blue for weeks, turned to a bruised slate gray in the space of an hour. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that quickly escalated into a high-pitched shriek. Then the snow began, not in gentle flakes, but in a horizontal, blinding sheet of white. The town hunkered down. Smoke from every chimney was immediately whipped away and obliterated by the gale. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Inside their homes, families huddled close to their stoves, stuffing rags into the gaps in their doorframes and window sashes, fighting a losing battle against the insidious, probing fingers of the cold that found every crack and flaw in their construction. The wind was a physical presence, a battering ram that shook the walls of even the sturdiest cabins and sent icy drafts swirling across the floors. For the inhabitants of Providence Bend, a blizzard was a familiar enemy, a siege to be endured with grim fortitude. Inside the hull of the Wanderer, Eliza stoked her small stove. She fed it not with large logs, but with small, dense pieces of dried cottonwood, keeping the fire low and steady. This was the most critical phase, the period of waiting where she had to trust the principles she had so laboriously put into practice. The outcome was invisible, the success or failure of her entire endeavor measured only by the subtle sensations of the environment she had created. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The wind howled over the riverbank, and she could hear the dry, sandy snow scouring the sod on her roof. But inside, the sounds were muted, distant, as if happening in another world. The thick, insulated hull, further buffered by the berm of earth and the deep blanket of snow that was now accumulating against it, deadened the roar of the wind to a dull bass rumble. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The long, black stovepipe radiated a steady, even warmth that filled the space from one end to the other. She walked the length of her home, from the stern to the forward bulkhead, and the temperature was remarkably consistent. She ran her bare hand along the inner wall of the hull. It was cool, but not the biting, soul-leeching cold of an exterior wall in a blizzard. It was neutral, a perfect barrier. Her father had always said that the proof of good design was not in how it handled ideal conditions, but in how it behaved under maximum stress. This was that moment. She was not merely surviving the storm. She was living in defiance of it, in a pocket of calm and warmth carved out of the heart of the chaos. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a system that worked in harmony with its environment. The snow that threatened to bury the other houses was, for her, simply more insulation, its weight adding to the seal, its white blanket protecting her sod roof from the scouring wind. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in a simple chair she had constructed from driftwood, listening to the gentle hiss of the stove and the distant, muffled howl of the blizzard. She felt a quiet, profound sense of triumph, a feeling that had nothing to do with proving others wrong, but everything to do with proving her father, and the principles he had lived by, right. The sensory proof was absolute. The steady warmth on her skin, the silence in her ears, the absence of the telltale scent of wood smoke that would indicate a poor draw. It was the culmination of months of labor, of ridicule, of faith. The boat was not just a home. It was a validation of a way of seeing the world, a testament to the idea that true understanding could conjure safety and comfort from what others saw only as ruin. The blizzard raged for 2 full days and nights. On the third morning, the world awoke to a profound and blinding silence. The wind had died, the sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the snow lay in massive, sculpted drifts that had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and new. Smoke rose from the chimneys of Providence Bend in straight, white columns into the frigid air. Doors were dug out, and neighbors began to check on one another. The primary concern was for Amos Kelleher. A massive drift had collapsed a section of his sod roof during the second night, filling his home with snow and forcing his family to spend the rest of the storm huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their stove fighting a hopeless battle against the invading cold. He was a proud man, but his youngest son had developed a deep, rattling cough, and his wife's face was pale with exhaustion. When he finally cleared a path from his door, his first thought, after his own family's immediate needs, was a grim one. He thought of the girl in the boat. No one, he reasoned, could have survived the storm in such a place. It was his duty, as a leading man in the community, to go down and see what had become of her. He expected to find a tomb of ice and snow. He trudged through the deep snow down to the riverbank, his breath pluming in the intensely cold air. The sight was almost unrecognizable. The wanderer was nearly buried, only the peak of its sod roof and the black stovepipe visible above a monumental drift. There was no smoke coming from the pipe, and a knot of dread and grim satisfaction tightened in his chest. He had been right, after all. He had warned her. As he got closer, however, he saw a narrow path already shoveled from the doorway, which was set deep into the earthen berm. And then the door opened. Eliza stood there, wearing a simple dress, her hair pinned up. She looked not merely like a survivor. She looked rested. But what struck Amos with the force of a physical blow was the plume of warm, gentle air that washed over him from the open doorway. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a stable, comfortable warmth, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of dried herbs and brewed tea. He stood there, speechless, his mouth slightly agape. Behind her, in the soft light of a lantern, he could see a space that was not a damp, miserable hovel, but a clean, dry, and impossibly warm room. "Mr. Kelleher," Eliza said, her voice calm, "is everything all right?" Amos Kelleher was not a man given to apologies or admissions of error. He looked from her face to the warm interior, then back to the frozen, snow-drowned landscape around them. He saw his own miserable, half-ruined soddy up on the hill. He felt the deep, lingering chill in his own bones. He thought of his shivering son. The evidence was irrefutable, a direct challenge to the foundations of his practical, hard-won knowledge. He had seen a girl playing in the mud, and he had been wrong. He had seen a rotten boat, and he had been wrong. He had seen folly, and he had been wrong. He finally met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a destitute girl, but a woman of formidable understanding. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "My roof came down," he said, the words plain, stripped of all his usual bluster. "My boy. He's taken sick with the cold." He paused, the next words costing him a great deal. "It's warm in here, warmer than my own house ever was." It was the most profound admission of defeat and respect he was capable of making. Eliza simply nodded. "Bring him here," she said. "There is plenty of room." That day marked a turning point for Eliza Gable and for Providence Bend. Amos brought his son, and Constance Hartwell, hearing the news, came with hot broth. They entered the boathouse not as visitors to a curiosity, but as supplicants seeking refuge. They marveled at the quiet, the pervading warmth, the utter dryness of the air. Amos ran his hand along the inner hull, just as Eliza had, feeling the smooth, dry oak, and finally began to understand. He asked her then, his voice stripped of its authority and filled with genuine curiosity, how she had done it. And so Eliza explained. She spoke of the double hull, of the principle of insulation, of the long stovepipe and the fresh air intake. She did not speak with pride or condescension, but with the simple clarity of a teacher explaining a fundamental truth. She shared her knowledge freely, sketching the design of the stove system in the frost on the floorboards with a stick. Amos Kelleher, the practical skeptic, listened with the rapt attention of a student, and when he finally understood the elegant, simple physics of it all, he just slowly shook his head in wonder. He had spent his life working hard. She had shown him the value of working smart, of understanding the unseen forces that govern their world. The boathouse on the riverbank became a permanent and respected feature of Providence Bend. In the spring, Amos Kelleher, along with 2 other men from the town, helped Eliza build a proper stone foundation under the stern and reinforce the berm against the floods. They did not do it out of pity, but out of a deep and abiding respect for the ingenuity she had shown. The long stovepipe design was copied in nearly every new structure built in the town, a simple innovation that dramatically improved the quality of life during the harsh Dakota winters. Eliza never married, but she adopted 2 children orphaned by a later epidemic, raising them in the warm, secure space of the wanderer. The house, a fusion of forgotten maritime engineering and frontier resourcefulness, served her for the rest of her life. Long after she was gone, it remained a local landmark, the boathouse that had been conjured from a wreck. Travelers on the river would hear the story of the young woman who bought a sunken boat for $2 and turned it into the warmest home in the territory. A home born not of luck or magic, but of a quiet, profound understanding of the principles that lie hidden just beneath the surface of things, waiting for a knowing eye to see them.